Buenas tardes a todas y a todos.
Good afternoon to all of you. We are about to start the third presentation of this PhD seminar of the Carlos V Awards, focusing on culture, history, memory, and heritage, integration, and peace. Those are the key words. And we're going to have the presentation of Unai Go Hernández. He'll be speaking about Europe's identity in the world and how the Union's values and ideas affect its international relations with third countries. This is indeed a very interesting topic, and it will be presented by Juan Carlos Moreno Piñero. He is the director of the European and Ibero-American Academy of Yuste Foundation. He holds a PhD in law from the University of Extremadura. He's been a lawyer and legal advisor for many companies in Extremadura. He's taught in the Santa Ana University Center, and he has a long career in research and management. He has made many articles related to the legal regime of foundations, and here I would like to explain that he's also in charge of a monthly publication for the Yuste Foundation. So I encourage you to subscribe if you want to read about all the collaborators. He's also a researcher in the sustainability chair in Carlos III. Among many other things. So before we start and give the floor to the doctor, I would like to share a short video. We believe that it's important for you to find out more about the foundation. Apart from what you knew already, we would like to show you a little bit more about the idea on the foundation and the values we defend. This is a very short video, just to make you curious and to convey an idea on the foundation. We made this video on the 30th anniversary of the foundation, which was last year. So please go ahead and play it. Thank you.
En tiempos convulsos,
los encuentros son más necesarios que nunca.
Lassen Sie uns Räume des Dialogs schaffen und der Reflexion.
Para reconocernos
nella diversità dei nostri accenti e delle nostre lingue.
But with the same language of respect for democracy, equality, and freedom.
Fundación Yuste, 30 años comprometidos con Europa e Iberoamérica.
Como prometido, era un vídeo muy corto, pero sí queríamos que tuvieses esa.
That was a very short video, and we wanted you to get a glimpse of what the Carlos V European Award means to us. It is an acknowledgement to the work of people, institutions, and projects contributing to the European project. And this is also one dimension, and there is another dimension, is the scholarships. It is important as a symbol and as an acknowledgement, but there is also, it has a very positive impact. Without further ado, I now give the floor to Juan Carlos Moreno Piñero. He will be introducing the next speaker. I have good news and bad news for myself. So the bad news is that I have to do the presentation after lunch, which is bad luck indeed, especially when you're the director, like I am. This is precisely the time where your blood is focusing on your stomach and it's not really in your head. And this is the perfect time for a siesta. A nice Spanish nap. But, okay, I'll have to discuss this with Miguel. It might be bad blood. And the good news is that I have to introduce you to Unai, which is very lucky for me. Unai Go HERNÁNDEZ, and I'm especially interested on this topic. Actually, last week I held a conference in the School of Diplomacy in Madrid with this topic very similar to yours. You deal with EU and China relations, and I work with EU, China, and Latin America relations, and the Chinese meddling. And we both speak about the new Belt and Road. Having said that, and of course, Unai is the important person right now, but let me tell you that this is not just about the EU-China relations, but it is also about the context and how it relates to the European values, and also the attack that some European political party might be doing to that relations, since they might understand that that could be an attack to European values. I've read some literature calling China the dragon that is sitting in Europe's backyard. Let me tell you one thing about Unai. He is very young, like the rest of them, like the rest of you, and he's brilliant, like the rest of you. But also, it happens that he works with theory and praxis. He's very well informed, and he's worked in both the public and private sectors. I love researching doctors, but I rely more on researching doctors who actually see patients, because while the research they do, they put it into practice with patients. And I love researchers, but I love researchers who take the research into the actual world. When you work in law, scientists ask, what research can you do in law? And I say, if there weren't any research to be done in law, we would still have God-given laws on Mount Sinai, or any of those ancient texts. In human sciences, of course, there is a research, and of course, if we take that to practice. So apart from that, Unai, let me know if I forget something, and we can keep on discussing after your presentation.
Muchas gracias, Juan Carlos.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos.
In English, because that's the language I use for my research, and that's the one I'm better acquainted with when it comes to these topics. First of all, I would like to give a special thank you to the Yuste Foundation, both to Juan Carlos and Miguel Ángel. I do believe that, unfortunately, higher education is not particularly well funded, not in our country, but also in other neighboring countries in the EU. So it's an absolute delight to be able to take part of these research scholarships when it comes to these issues. Also, to all the organizations who are making this possible, including the translation team, as well as the hospitality team, that they do a great job and normally go unnoticed. The second announcement I wanted to make is the reflection I had when dealing with this presentation. I come from the field of political science, international relations, and European studies, which in a way overlaps both those fields. And I saw in the different curricula that I was able to read that there were not many people with the same background I had. So I started reflecting that I needed to make a more multidisciplinary presentation. So I started making little tweaks in my PowerPoint. The paper remained almost unchanged because it's still academic. It's meant to be guided by this willingness of research, but the way of transmitting will be different. So bear with me for this following 43 minutes, even if it's siesta time here. I promise it will be worth it. So my research has to do with European identity. We have been discussing European identity the whole morning. We have heard that we have European values or that we don't have them in a way. Some institutions might exercise them, some institutions don't. However, we haven't been able to define what these values are or what identity is. Being a political scientist myself, I had the obligation to try to define it in the very own way that tailors to my research. Contextually speaking, I will speak to you about the European Union and the EU's relations with third countries with a specific focus on China. So, well, the research question is the one you could see in the title. I'm a very basic person when it comes to transmitting. I think the easier the things are for the listener, the better it will be for all of us. I take a special focus on China because, put it shortly, I believe it's the greatest danger liberal democracies have nowadays. I will develop way more on this idea, but we need to have a little bit of an understanding that the liberal democratic system or order that was built after the Second World War, not the first, but the most important test of stress it has been with the rise of China, particularly in the last years when it has been able to draw on other countries that were not traditionally part of our sphere. I'm thinking about African countries, but also, as Juan Carlos was saying, Latin American countries. So I do believe it's a great challenge. On the other side of the perspective, I'm taking the EU and Spain. I will justify these choices later on in my presentation. And I do believe this presentation, this research, is linked to one of the priorities of the calls of this year, the one that had to do with the contribution of European institutions to European values, with a particular reference to international organizations as well as international cooperation in general. So why China? Why choose this remote country in the easternmost part of Asia? We tend to listen that it's the biggest country in the world when it comes to population, which is not true anymore. India has surpassed China very recently, but it's still particularly significant. We also tend to hear economic arguments. China is a great economic power. But here, depending who are we talking to, we can see different arguments. If we listen to Americans, they will say, oh no, our GDP is still bigger than the Chinese one. If you listen to the Chinese, they will tell you, no, the GDP power in purchasing parity power, is bigger in China, and that is the case. And in that sense, if we use that measure, the biggest economic power nowadays is China. A quick reference to this way of measuring GDP has to do with the actual values, the price of those countries, rather than simply an absolute value of the GDP. Another argument would be the political one. We have been talking about the war in Ukraine a lot throughout the morning. We haven't really gone into this war, but we can all agree that it's an extremely important issue, particularly for Europe. Not that other wars are not important, but put it simply, this one is way closer from our borders than the ones we have lived in our surroundings before. I'm thinking about the 2011 civil war in Libya, Syria as well, or maybe Yemen a little bit farther away. What we are seeing lately is that a plethora of European leaders are trying to go to China, or they're actually going to China. I can think of Olaf Scholz, of Emmanuel Macron, or recently Pedro Sánchez as well, trying to convince the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, to take part, to mediate in this conflict. So this, in another way, shows how China has joined the table of the big powers in a way, and they can actually influence different decisions internationally. The third reason, and the most important one, as I was announcing from the beginning, is the systemic power China has. we have to understand that China is a revisionist power. They do not agree 100% with the liberal international order that we have, with the international system, with how it's set, because according from their perspective, it really doesn't benefit them. We have to understand that until the 19th century, China was one of the biggest and most important powers in the world, and due to the colonization that took place in Eastern Asia, the two Opium Wars, and a series of military conflicts that were unfavorable for China, this country lost this hegemonic power it had in this region. That's why they refer to the 19th century as the century of humiliation in a way. They want to go back to fix those issues, to get back to the power, to the position of power they believe they have. So this systemic variable is very important and shouldn't be discarded, even if the economic or the political one are way easier to see or to analyze. Here we can see a recent piece of news in which China is trying to control from the inside the United Nations. One might say, oh, but they do actually agree with this liberal international system. That's debatable. The fact that they have the chairs of the different committees, of the different international organizations within the UN system itself can allow them to exert different types of power. So we should be wary on them. On the other side, we should think, why Spain? We have 27 member states in the European Union, and Spain has not been particularly prominent traditionally in international relations. That's actually one of the reasons why we should consider Spain. The stakes are not particularly high for our country when it comes to dealing with international powers, so a little bit we will be able to see if those values actually apply or not, rather than economic interests or different political interests. Traditionally, we have seen other bigger countries in Europe, such as France. This was the early 2000s Sarkozy issue with the Dalai Lama. That's irritated China a lot. This has not been the case with Spain. And if we have a look at this macro infrastructure project that China has, the Belt and Road Initiative, and we see the different memoranda of understanding that they have signed. Here we can see the countries that have signed those memoranda in a yellowish color. We do not see Spain features there. So economically speaking, it's not particularly involved more than other countries, other European countries would be with China. Spain is also a middle power, which sometimes allows you to take not the leading role, but also not the following role. You can balance depending on the conflict or the international actor you are talking to. And also because there has been recent interest towards China. As I have mentioned before, there have been different high-level meetings between Spanish officials, representatives actually, or head of government, and the Chinese head of government as well. And also, I'm Spanish, so that makes it way easier to analyze a political system and be acquainted with the language that we are dealing with. What about the EU? Why is China important for the EU? It's one of the most relevant actors, and it has been that way since the publication of the 2019 EU-China strategy. Here you have highlighted at the bottom of the slide a little bit, which is the triple relationship the EU has towards China. So in one sense, China is a partner for cooperation and negotiation. In another sense, it's an economic competitor. And finally, it's a systemic rival. If you ask Chinese diplomats and Chinese scholars, they do not understand what this means. And I think it's fair enough to say that we do not really understand it 100%. Bear in mind that this was drafted in 2019. One could have said that things have changed in these 4 years, but recently the HRVP, Borrell, has stated that this statement is still valid. So definitely important for the EU. And also, when we put these two things in combination, Spain will be taking over the EU presidency from the 1st of July, although we don't know who will be the president of that presidency. But anyway, that reflects that Spain will be a priority for China as well, so it's worth the risk doing this, this investigation. After this more or less long justification, I do believe the justification needs to be long because it's the part in which you engage the audience and you justify all the work you have been doing. Here I'm presenting you a little bit, which is going to be the scheme or a little bit the guideline of the rest of the slides. It's an academic paper, so it needs to have a theoretical framework, the research design in which the methodology will be explained. Then I will show you which are some of the results, not all. More information on this is available on the paper, but not commented. And finally, I will draw some conclusions that may be useful for all of us. So when it comes to the theory, I'm trying to portray in a way which are the theories that EU scholars or international relations scholars tend to use when approaching international reality. So this is a way of simplifying international reality. We are understanding this reality as very complex. As we cannot consider all these variables, we need to focus on some variables specifically. We narrow them down. Put it differently, we are simply using a pair of lenses through which we see reality. Depending on these lenses, we will focus on some variables or on others. If we think about feminism, also that's something similar to this. When you put the feminist lenses on, you are looking at a series of specific variables that were not looked at before. So with international relations theory, we need to think in the same way. In fact, feminism is also a way of looking at the international reality. I wanted to make a quick summary of which have been the main theories in international relations. The first one is realism. These authors might be familiar to you, Carr, Morgenthau, or Hedley Bull. They tended to describe the world in a very realist way. So many people call them pragmatic because they focused on the power relations that were between states. And only states were the important actors when it comes to international relations. Another set of theorists, the liberals, had their focus on different tendencies, such as economic cooperation and cooperation in general. They did understand, that the states were important actors, but they were not the only ones. So in a way, the scope of which actors to consider was expanded in a way. And we can see traditional thinkers such as Locke, Rousseau, Kant, or Jeremy Bentham as being the pillars of this strand of thought. But none of these can explain how does identity influence international relations. Therefore, we have to turn into constructivism. Constructivism is an international relations theory that has to do with this idea that reality is a social construct. And the seminal work of this way of thinking is Alexander Bent's 1999 work in which he stated that, okay, there was anarchy, but anarchy was basically what states made of it. So the international system could be blended depending on which were the actors working on this international system. It has to do as well with the works of Rogge and Kratochvil, and all this constructivist construct has to do as well with the concept of the liberal international order. We have been discussing this morning, I think it was Enrique Moradiellos who was thinking about this concept, talking about the concept of the West, Occidente this morning, and it has a lot to do with this conceptualization of the liberal international order. I have mixed feelings towards it because the track record of the West, understood it in a flexible way, can be troublesome sometimes. But from the analytical point of view, it's extremely useful, particularly when we're talking about identity, values, and ideas. So we'll stick with it without making any ethical considerations about itself. I use the works of these Dudney and Ickenberry when it comes to the liberal international order, and they state that this order was basically built after the Second World War. It's based on values and norms norms, and it has to do with international organizations. Typical after Second World War organizations we can think of were the ones that derived from the Bretton Woods Conference, 1944, the IMF and the World Bank, and the failed trial to create the WTO. We can also think about the Conference of San Francisco. Just 1 year afterwards, 1945, the UN Charter was designed there, and that kickstarted the process of the working of the international organization, but also the EU. Here we can see the Schuman Declaration, which has to do with this conceptualization of reality. Values and norms are what matters, and these international organizations make sure that what matters is put forward, beyond power, beyond economic, simply economic cooperation. When talking about identity, things get a little bit more complex. We all know what identity is, but it's quite difficult to define identity. I draw on the definition by Abdelal et alia. They state that identity is a social category that varies in terms and content, in terms of content and contestation of them, which is quite vague in a way, but that's what identity is, because people can understand it in a very different way. So in this sense, the content would be the ideas and values that have to do with this liberal international order linked to the EU. And the contestation would basically be the identification with the identity. Does an international actor identify with this European identity, the EU or Spain? Or maybe this actor doesn't, such as China. That's also one of the justifications for choosing such a different actors. If you're trying to contrast different identities, you need to have very different actors. If I would have chosen the EU and the US, the difference when it comes to identity wouldn't have been that great. When it comes to China, results are way more to the point. The benefits are that it's an ample definition and it's easy to operationalize, as I will show you in the next slide, and it's coherent with the theory that I have chosen with constructivism. But there are some limitations. Basically, it's still vague, okay, ideas and values. We put that into, we detail that assertion, but still vague. But I use it as a simplification or as a proxy. What values? As Teresa Freixas mentioned this morning in the second article of the Treaty of the European Union, the values of the EU are given, which are human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, and the rule of law, as well as respect for human rights. Some of these values overlap, and it's very difficult to operationalize them in a way. If I turn to the Spanish Constitution, which is my study case, I see that there is like a guarantee of democratic coexistence. And if we go a little bit further into our Constitution, in the Article 1.1, the Constitution states that Spain is constituted as a social and democratic state governed by the rule of law, which upholds freedom, justice, equality, political pluralism as the highest values in its legal system. So put it shortly, I have selected democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. I know they kind of overlap with some of the ones mentioned in the second article of the Treaty of the European Union, but I had to select them, in order to operationalize them. Of course, my understanding of values is not universal. The EAS thinks that EU solidarity and security are values as well. This was in 2015. They might have changed their point of view. And we even have a commissioner for defending the European way of life. So maybe his understanding of the European values might vary a little bit from my own. And the ideas that I'm choosing are basically the ones related to the liberal international order, this belief in norms and values and the workings of international organization. I also talk about influence, the way that these ideas can influence the EU's international relations as well as Spain's international relations towards China. It's very difficult to define influence as well. It's also one of these very commonly used concepts, such as identity. Everyone knows what influence is. is, what influencing means, but nobody defines it in academia. Academics in political science, they use Dahl's definition of power, which is not really influence, it's power, but they use it as a proxy. Some people turn to Weber. I decided to make my own as well. And for that, I use the scholarship that has to do with lobbies, EU lobbying, in which they basically compare the initial position paper of a given lobby with the final result of a regulation. If the initial version of this paper and the final result is similar, that means that the lobby has been able to influence, which is useful, but maybe not applicable to this kind of more complex concepts, such as international relations. So I explain it as the capacity that an actor or group or an idea, or an identity has to alter one or various parts of the policy process, of the ways of creating this policy. The following part, the one that has to do with the research design, will be divided into 3 subsections. I will explain you which is my main method, coding, qualitative analysis, then the documents I have analyzed and why I have chosen them, and finally some limits in a way of making some disclaimers that I'm not able to research everything I would have liked to. So what is coding? Before my PhD, I thought it was something like this. So what people who are studying informatics do, but it couldn't be farther from this. It's a way of looking at text, of analyzing text. This is an example of coding, the different colors you have in that text. You're basically creating some categories in a cyclical way in order to extract some specific information from a given text, or in my case, a set of texts. Put it more formally, coding is an open process in which the researcher analyzes different data sources in a cyclical manner. Okay? Therefore, first of all, when you want to code something, you need to decide what that cycle will be. In my case, the cycle has different steps. First of all, I do some preliminary coding. I read a key document, and I extract key ideas from that document, and that way I start creating my categories. One category can be economy, another one can be politics, although in this case that was too broad. So in that sense, I create these specific categorizations. Then I conduct first cycle coding, which has to do with the specific ideas of each of the paragraphs of the document I'm researching. Here we have 2 different parts. The one that has to do with the more specific or elemental conceptions of the document, and one that has to do with the more affective part. Is this sentence positive? Is this sentence negative? And therefore we'll have to extract some conclusions from there. Although I have to tell you, and I advance you this, which is one of the conclusions, it was very difficult to carry out affective coding when it comes to policy, to legislation, basically, because when you're drafting legislation, you're not meant to include that those emotions into the regulation that is being drafted. In a second stage, second cycle coding takes place. This basically has to do that you compare your codes and you analyze them from a longitudinal point of view. You extract some patterns, you group the results, and you extract conclusions from there. It will be way clearer when you see the specific results. It might sound a little bit too theoretical at this point, but bear with me. You will see it's easier later on. So which were my codes? I used, important, the minimum coding unit. You have to define what are you coding as a minimum. I had 2 minimum levels of coding when it comes to the EU paragraphs, because EP resolutions, which are the documents I'm looking at from the EU's perspective, they write in paragraphs. They don't write sentences. They're very long paragraphs separated by semicolons, but you cannot really differentiate one semicolon from another because you're losing the context of the whole paragraphs. Whereas when it comes to the Spanish documents, which were extracted from the Congreso de los Diputados, meaning the lower chamber of our parliament, they are sentences. I have analyzed questions to the government, and members of parliament write in normal sentences, not in strange paragraphs, as it is the case of the European Parliament. So now, yes, which are my codes? I used the resolution calling for a new EU-China strategy as my preliminary coding document. Why? Because these strategies tend to tell all-encompassing in a way. There are a big variety of topics included in the document. They are extremely long as well. There were about 150 different paragraphs, so it was quite tricky to tackle all this document, but it was super useful. I created a first set of coding that had to do with human rights, categorized then by the different regions in China that have human rights problems. One can argue that the whole China has. That's why we have human rights in China as a subcode. But then we have specific problematics when it comes to Xinjiang, or the province which is in the westernmost part of China, Hong Kong, as we all know, Tibet, although it has been forgotten recently, Xinjiang and Hong Kong tend to be more prominent. Tiananmen, the massacre that took place in 1989, tends to come back because it was a definitory moment in EU-China relations, but also Spanish-China relations. The arms embargo that China has by many European countries is derived from that incident, and then also Inner Mongolia. A second category of coding has to do with how does that specific international actor relate with China at the EU level, at the bilateral level, at the multilateral level. Do they have relations with Taiwan, which is an extremely important issue for China? And finally, although this subcode has not been used, in the 16+1 format, which is a little bit Central and Eastern European countries, so the newcomers to the EU in the last enlargement rounds. Another group of coding was interinstitutional references. EU institutions love to write, to talk about what other EU institutions should be doing, what they are drafting the resolutions. You will see later on the results, but this is not the case when it comes to the Spanish government. There is no interinstitutional reference in that regard, and they sometimes also conduct policy recommendations. Liberal democracy was another code. If I'm trying to look at the value of democracy, I need to have this code here, as well as human rights. I have 3 different codings: alternative system to liberal democratic systems, which is China, basically. Difficult to define what China is, but let's call it not a liberal democracy, so alternative system. Chinese territories with democratic values in reference to Hong Kong, and finally liberal democratic systems making a reference to the EU and to Spain. Economy was also a big deal when it comes to the coding. You have 3 different categorizations: investment, trade, and free market economy. In investment, we can find the aforementioned Belt and Road Initiative, this huge investment plan. We also have the agreement, the comprehensive agreement on investment that was approved 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, but it hasn't been ratified because China sanctioned some European MEPs and some researchers at a think tank in Germany. Therefore, it was put on hold, in a way, this agreement. And also trade, because that's a huge issue. What's the trade deficit with China for a variety of countries in the EU, Spain included. International organizations, here I'm making reference to that priority of the call, the Bretton Woods institutions, the consequence of the San Francisco conference, the UN, and I have also included NATO because it featured prominent in the analysis. And the WTO, of course, as a consequence not of the Bretton Woods Conference, but of the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, GATT, that eventually in 1995 became a fully fledged international organization. Another code is the third side of these values, rule of law. How well do we respect freedom of press, religion, speech, association, and separation of powers, which have been and still are an issue in China and on EU-China relations or Spanish-EU relations. I also made an honorable mention to civil society because it wasn't present in many documents at the beginning, but it came up as soon as I started coding, so I thought it should be included. Technology was also another one of these cases, and sanctions was also a different one. Geography seemed to be at the beginning a huge deal, but eventually didn't have much importance on the analysis. And surprisingly, culture was not very prominent when it comes to these relations, as we will see later on. This is the time of the disclaimers. Some things that I need to explain. Can we really compare these units, the paragraphs by the EU, to the sentences of the Spanish institutions? Yes, because we are not looking at the nature of the units, but at the content. So what does this unit tell me, no matter how long or how short it is? How do we manage hundreds of coding units using software? It's humanly impossible to do it otherwise. I have used NVivo coding software, which has allowed me to create the series of graphs I will be showing you later on. And finally, the documents that I have been analyzed, I did the selection based on these 3 values. Initially, they were 24. I discovered it was impossible to deal with 24 at the same time, so eventually I had to settle for 11. 5 from the EU, 6 from Spain, and equally or almost equally distributed between democracy, rule of law, and human rights. Here you have the list, but it's basically that categorization I have told you. And finally, the limits of this investigation. I wasn't able to analyze all European member states. Unfortunately, 27 is quite a big lot. I had to settle for 1, Spain. I was also not able to analyze different European institutions. I had to settle for the Parliament. I thought that being the biggest democratic demos we have in the EU was worth a try. Temporal limits are different, unfortunately, because surprisingly, the Spanish Congress, the lower chamber, has digitized all their documents since the first legislature started in 1979, whereas the European Parliament hasn't. It's only from 1999 that you can access these digital documents. And finally, linguistic limits. You cannot compare coding in Spanish and coding in English, so I automatically translated all Spanish documents into English using software, and then I did some controls on my own. Being a native speaker, I thought that would be enough, although it can be a critic very well. Results. How am I going to show you the results? I will first of all start in a very general way, so comparing codes, considering all the documents, the 11 documents I researched. Then by level of analysis, the EU on one side and Spain in the other side, to see if these concepts of multi-level governance we were discussing before also have an impact on influence and how, on identity and on how identity influences international relations. Also by code, by each of these categories: economy, culture, technology, sanctions, human rights. And finally, I will just compare one document because the results were very long and I couldn't comment them all. More information is on the paper if anyone is interested. So which were the most used codes? So which were the topics that came the most? First of all, human rights. We can understand that this is because human rights is a very easily identifiable issue. In a way, we have the Human Rights Council at the UN. We also have a set of human rights instruments at the Council of Europe, as it has been mentioned this morning. So it's quite easy to make this linkage. Second of all, relationships with China, the way in which the EU and Spain relates to China, be it at the bilateral, multilateral, EU level. Then we have internal institutional reference, although I have to tell you that this was mainly the EU, as I was mentioning before. Then we have liberal democracy, which is the most present in all documents. Sorry, I forgot to mention the difference between the columns. The first column, the one that starts with a 9, has to do with the number of documents this code is present. So we have 11 documents. Liberal democracy is present in 10 out of those 11. The second column has to do with the number of times that code featured those documents. So in those 11 documents, liberal democracy was featured 111 10 times, whereas human rights, it was more than double, okay? And then we see that other codes, such as the civil society, rule of law, technology, sanctions, or geography and culture, are almost not present, which actually tells us something about how big international actors such as the EU and Spain conduct their international relations. This shows that they basically do not pay attention to this last category, which is something to reflect upon as well. It's still regarded as a very internal competence, right? So in the Spanish Constitution, Article 149, and one of these coordinating and support competencies for the EU. Here you have a breakup of the different codes, like depending on where human rights are, which are the most mentioned. We can see the human rights in China, the most general one, closely followed by Xinjiang, because it has been trendy, put it shortly and badly probably, recently. And you can see there the different breakup of a more detailed explanation of this coding. When we go into this graph, I'm not really sure if you are able to read it properly. The green color on the top left side has to do with human rights, so the most popular code. Then we have relations with China. We move on into this interinstitutional reference, liberal democracy, economy, big deal for the EU, particularly when it comes to investment and trade, international organizations here, and then the other small codes I have mentioned, rule of law, civil society, technology. But I thought this was a visual way of seeing what I was mentioning before on those tables, which might be more useful for a paper, but not for a presentation, particularly when I have this multidisciplinary nature. I have also created a word bubble, because this could be interesting for some people, so which are the most frequently used terms in all these documents. The thing that I'm considering here, both Spain and the EU. So of course, China and Chinese will feature very prominently, as they should, but we also see some humanity, rights, Kong, in reference to Hong Kong, of course, and then these kind of buzzwords the European Parliament uses, calls, regards, whereas, union, global, parliament, foreign, etc. Okay? Moving forward to the specific differences between the two levels, the EU and Spain, I'm going to compare here the general results of both, okay? So all codes included. The picture on the left-hand side has to do with the EU. The picture on the right-hand side has to do with Spain. What do we see? First of all, the brownish square, the one that has to do with interinstitutional references. Second for the EU, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth for Spain. That means that the EU, as I was saying before, the EU loves to send indications, at the European Parliament specifically, indications to the Commission, to the Council of the European Union, to the member states, but the Spanish Parliament doesn't really make any reference beyond the Spanish Parliament itself, not even to the EU, that is also important about how different actors in the multi-level governance system understand the role and each other. We clearly see that human rights is prominent in both aspects. This salience I was talking about before, easy to identify, very prominent in the international arena, might be an explanation for that. Something that caught my eye was that international organizations features third for the Spanish case, and it's mainly references to the UN, and this wasn't the case of the EU. This might have to do with rivalry between international organizations. The EU is an organization of its own, so it might be understandable for them not to say, hey, it's the other international organizations. No, it's us, because we are the organization. Whereas in the case of Spain, even if they're part of the EU, they reference a lot more than the EU. They reference the United Nations, which is something also to consider when we're talking about this European identity, how ingrained it's in our Spanish character. And we also have word clouds if we want to compare them. Again, on the left-hand side, the European one, on the right-hand side, the Spanish one. Let's go to the analysis between codes, so categories, okay? The one in human rights. Here we can see the different documents. Probably it's not easy to read, but the code is very simple. EP means European Parliament, Spain means Spain. ROL means rule of law. And then we have as well democracy, meaning democracy, and HR, meaning human rights. So, ironically, the documents that were categorized as human rights, they were not the ones that were the most references to human rights. They were the ones related to rule of law. This might have to do with the wording. Sorry, those documents use. If you understand that a document has to do with human rights, perhaps you do not have to repeat human rights 1,000 times. Whereas if you're talking about rule of law, you need to specify this difference. If we go in the interinstitutional differences, no surprise here. The top two has to do with EP documents. So the EU, the biggest resolution on a new EU-China strategy, and also a document, the one in green here, that had to do with the violation of fundamental rights in China. The Spanish document on human rights came the third, so lagging quite behind. International organizations, here we have the EP document first, so the European Parliament one first, but making reference to themselves, not to the UN. And then we have the Spanish human rights documents making references to the UN and to a lesser extent to the EU. When it comes to liberal democracy, the EP was very prominent. Here, we need to wait until the fifth document, the small square in blue here, to find a Spanish document that mentions liberal democracy in a very specific way, which is also telling of the role Spain thinks we have in the international arena. When it comes to relations with China, it's fairly distributed, so almost in the equal level. They normally call either for the bilateral or EU level relations. Rule of law also was prominent in the EP rather than Spain, maybe linked to the conceptualization of human rights, although it's not clear for me 100%. Sanctions were equally distributed as well. And then when it comes to technology, it was barely not mentioned. This means only 2 documents. Geography, only 1 document in the biggest strategy. And economy, a variety of documents. And finally, culture, only in 1 document and at the Spanish level, and only making references to Instituto Cervantes. So the conceptualization of culture in international relations was fairly narrowed when it came to these documents. We could also compare specifically the sets of documents that had to do with democracy, but I think it's more worth it considering the time jumping to the outcomes that I got from my research. That has to do basically that the top 3 codes are human rights, institutional relations, and relations with China. So only 1 of the 3 values I was codifying was in that top 3. And the second bullet point has to do with liberal democracy, international organizations, and rule of law being in a secondary nature. This idea that the EU references itself a lot and Spain doesn't really, and then that economy does not really feature prominently for Spain. In the case of liberal democracy, Spain did not make any references to Taiwan or Hong Kong. That might have to do with the size of the actor as well, and they were not in EU reference at the member state level with Spain. So finally, and I will conclude with this, how does identity influence EU-China relations? It influences highly. As we can see, those values that were defined at the beginning, they're very prominent in this coding analysis, although not all values influence in the same way. Human rights, that basic value is the most prominent one. And this is particularly true when it comes to the EU and the issue of human rights, as I was saying. The limits of the investigation, the size of the documents and the imbalances of these documents. Some documents were way longer, some others were shorter, but as I stated, the results are proportional. So what you were seeing in each of the documents didn't have to do with the length of the document per se. Some codes were not really useful, geography, cultural, and technology, which should have been eliminated, and the temporal criteria wasn't ideal due to the limitations of the European Parliament. How could we improve this? Using computer-based techniques, using coding in R, most frequent words, etc., and inclusion of the whole universe when it comes to the Spanish case. And finally, this difficulty in application of effective coding. That has been all. Thank you very much. I will be very happy to take your questions now.
El número 3, por favor. 3. Adelante.
Unai, mis más sinceras.
Well, Unai, congratulations. Or as Eric would say, chapo. So congratulations on both the contents and the presentation, because it was extraordinary. I am honest when I say that I do not feel like I can criticize any of what you said, because the contents and the rationale was very deep and very good. I cannot dare to tell you what is good or bad. I just want to make a comment about the China and Europe relations. This is a very complex topic. And I like to talk about history, even if I'm not in the best position to talk about history, because we have historians here. Enrique Moradillos, Jesus Baigorri, Rosa Martínez de Codes. And when it comes to history, this is what I'm going to say. This room was Charles V's bedroom. He spent here 3 months, and he was kept informed of what was going on in the world. He was 58. And he only spent 7 years in Spain out of 58. So that means that he spent 40-something years traveling or fighting to control the Mediterranean Sea and Central Europe, but especially the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean means the sea between the land or the lands. That was the world's most important geostrategic axis. And when the American colonization began in 1522, the axis began shifting towards the west and the Atlantic. And it is now shifting more and more towards Asia and the Pacific. But the shifting from the Mediterranean towards America took several centuries. But China got independent in 1949. In 1949, an American Secretary of State, I don't remember his name, said, China has no future. People's Republic of China has no future, because you cannot feed 549 million of people. If you read Henry Kissinger's memoirs, he was the first one to talk about the diplomacy between America, the United States, and China. I think Henry Kissinger is 99 or 100 years old now. And he says that he was surprised to see China thrive. He could have never imagined it. So my point is, China, or the most important, the hegemony now is in Asia or the Pacific, because in Europe the average age is like 49 or 50 or something like that, and it's only 400 million people. And in China, in Asia, people are younger, and you have 3 billion people. If you analyze the foreign policies in China, we can notice it is an opaque system. We have no accurate analysis of what is going on in China because the foreign policy is not clear. The lines are blurred. Or at least we know that they try to expand commercially and physically, geographically. Similar powers in history did the same. Spain, in the Golden Century, tried to do the same. They tried to evangelize. It was also a method to make a lot of people work, many soldiers and many other people. Spain tried to evangelize. China is not trying to evangelize us. They're not trying to sell us Confucius teachings. No. It's all about trade and money. You know that in the new Silk Route, many Ibero-American countries are now involved in the new route. But I think they're justified. Those commercial interests are justified. What cannot be justified is the attack on the traditional values. That is a red flag, and that is a hardline. And China could be attacking the European traditional values, just as Russia is attacking the Ukraine. It is an attack to its borders and its geography, but also the European values, because they don't fit in their interests. They clash with their interests. Some people say that China is the dragon that is in our backyard, and I hope the dragon will sleep for some more time. Thank you. Sorry, no microphone. Well, I try to answer your questions in the languages you use for the questions. Well, first of all, I totally agree with the risk or the danger for one of the players of this match. If you win the match, or if you win the game by not respecting the rules, we're playing, it has to be fair play. If you play a game, you have to follow the rules. Commercial exchanges with China are beneficial for China and for the European countries. Traditionally, there was some reciprocity, and the barriers for people who want to invest in China are only for European countries. You know that you have to create a joint venture if you want to invest in China, but for Chinese companies, they can invest everywhere. They can just bid on tenders. Secondly, we all tend to think that our countries are the most important ones. And it's like a competition. That's why Borrell used to say that China is a systemic danger, because we are rivals. We're rivals, sorry. And I know that the reality of China, or the reality China is trying to sell to us regarding the BRIC countries, is totally different from the one they are openly or publicly saying. So, in other words, what they say in their internal communications has nothing to do with what they say publicly. So the player, China, the player of this game, is not respecting the rules. And after the Washington Consensus in the 90s and the end of the Fukuyama ideology and the neoliberal triumphalism, they used to say it was the only game in town, the only possible choice. And now, 30 or 40 years later, we can see that was not the case, and we need to adapt to it. So the resolution of the European Parliament on China is a good clarification, but we'll have to see how influential it is. Enrique Moradiellos. Congratulations on your exposé. You hit the nail. It was impeccable. It was interesting. And it gives us many ideas. Many complex ideas. And sometimes, or not always, harmonic. I try to make this very short. It was a magnificent work on international relations, political sociology, but I want to talk about a new driver here. I want to talk about gnosiological tenets or epistemological tenets that will require for you to nuance it and to reflect upon them, some values and ideas. Let's say tenets or terms. I don't know if you have any semantic field that is not confusing. We're talking about something that is not about the being that feels and thinks, my awareness, my conscience that existed before Descartes. Even if nobody looks at me or nobody listens to me. And the third gender, or the third world, according to Popper, world, soul, God, the transcendental. That lies beyond the idea of person and the intangible values, ideas. Because we talk about human rights in a very shallow way. But human rights is a clear concept. A equals A, and that's it, undoubtedly. But to start with, God doesn't speak Spanish, so what is the first time the term human rights was coined or was ever used? At Atapuerca? No. It's impossible. We cannot talk about that notion of humanitas before the Stoicism, because there was Alexander the Great and his empire. There was dignitas, but nobody said people had rights. No, they felt, they suffered, but they were slaves, and senators and free people, they did not talk about human rights. So at least we have to question this, at least as terms, as a term, the notion, the concept of human rights in the law or international relations has to be key. But a human right, the basic human right is food, being fed, because otherwise I cease to exist. That's the only human right a human person conceives. And secondly, you were talking about constructivism, that is your ideology, and I agree with it, so I think it makes sense. But I recommend you to read Criticism of Constructivism, the Fear of Knowledge. Paul Gogosian, he's a professor of epistemology at Columbia University, because sometimes constructivism is composed of many different things. For example, Charles V or Francis I were totally agreed on just one thing. They both wanted to conquer Milan. That is a contradiction, because you're saying that according to constructivism, reality is a construction. Yes, but that was also said by Aristotle. That is not what constructivism means. We have to go one step forward. That is a random and arbitrary convention. That is something else. That is different. It's not conventional. Dignitas, dignity, and reality are not conventional things. But this is the universal value. And look at human rights or gender equality, which are now the new human rights accepted by almost everyone. Well, I would say I would talk about many different things, because you made me think of many things, but it's impossible. I just want to mention some of the things that you refer to as values or ideas that in the end are meta-European items. They existed millennia and centuries before you, and before this, justice is not a European thing, because the first legal text around the idea of justice were written by the Sumerians in Kuwait or Iraq now. So I invite you to rethink or revisit these ideas.
Muchas gracias, profesor Moradiellos. Profesor Elber.
Thank you very much, Professor Moradiellos. Professor Herbert.
From my side as well, that was a nice piece of academic work. I really enjoyed listening to you. But now I would like to ask you to put some butter to the fish, as they say in my country. There is this discussion going on about a Europe or EU-Chinese strategy, a new strategy towards China. What would you recommend?
Thank you. Maybe you can ask the question, or you can answer the question a little bit, and then we go to the next. Another question over here, and then you. We have two here, and then so Anna Milosevic, Jesus Baigorri, and
okay.
Rosa. But maybe you want.
Maybe Unai, you should respond first.
Yeah. ¿Le damos micro al atril, por favor? Sí, ahora.
Me parece muy buen apunte el que haces de esta reflexión que tengo que llevar.
I think that you're right. I need to go beyond my field, and that's why I was interested in being here. I'm not used to dealing with other fields, so that's why I try to explain what I understand by realism and so on. But obviously, there is a large debate on human rights, its universality, or the universalization of them by the West, or what I understand by constructivism. I might have got into the details, because otherwise I would be getting into a realism that it is not so. I was focusing on certain aspects, and I didn't specify everything that I had to make clear. And then regarding your reflection on the contents, on the values and ideas, I chose the most simple option. I went to the treaties and see what the treaties claim the Europeans' values to be. So it is not me who is saying that, but somehow I am promoting, reflecting upon them. Maybe I should have specified certain things.
Potential recommendation I would make for the new EU-China strategy? That's an excellent question, an extremely difficult one to answer. Of course, I think what we need are binding mechanisms at the European level. A clear example, the foreign direct investment screening mechanism was approved in 2019 because in the 2010s, in that decade, there were plenty of investments coming from China to the EU, which were very feared by member states. Comparatively speaking, they were less than the ones coming from the US, but it seems that we trust the Americans but not the Chinese in the European Union. Okay, so this foreign direct investment screening mechanism was created. But actually, the mechanism doesn't have any binding instrument. So the Commission can recommend, can say, okay, this specific policy area is sensitive. So what? If the member state isn't forced to apply any kind of measure, then it's not useless, because it brings the public attention to the issue, but it's not effective. So I would propose binding mechanism, be it in foreign direct investment, being in trade, being in the way of that we conduct bilateral relations. The EU specifically stated that signing memoranda of understanding with China in the concept of the BRI was not advisable. We have 15 EU member states that have signed it. How is this possible? Of course, it's very difficult for the EU to tell sovereign powers you cannot do an MOU. But still, I think that we need higher levels of coordinations and binding instruments. I don't know what happened with the Conference of the Future of Europe and all the promises that came from that consultation process. It was meant to be the big project of Macron, and we have stopped hearing about it. Creating binding mechanisms would have been a great outcome of that consultation process. But that will be my take on what to implement.
Okay, thank you. We have just 8 minutes, and we have like a few hands. So we have Ana Milosevic. I don't think we have time for everybody. Ana Milosevic, we have Jesus Begorri, we have Rosa, and we have Camilo, and then we'll see we have more time for us. No te he visto.
Is it on? Yeah. Okay, thank you, Unai, for your presentation. You really took us by the hand and explained, walked us through all the steps of your research process and thinking as well. Thank you for that. Later on, I will ask you to which faculty at KU Leuven are you affiliated with, because you were not in my class.
No.
Okay, so really fast. I'm not totally convinced that the EU identity frame is something that is adequate for the questions that you're asking in your research, because you speak about European identity in your presentation, but then when you actually operationalize, you talk about values and norms. So identities, values, norms, collective memories, they are all buzzwords in the EU policy language since the 70s, and they all mean different things. As you rightfully said, there are some overlaps when we look at the how you operationalized what the EU values are in the EU documents. But these are, as I said this morning, these are universal rights and universal values. So what makes them European? So this is one comment. The second comment is you speak about influence. So if you speak about identity, if you speak about values, if you speak about norms, and then you put on the influence, but you do not say what is the interest behind the influence, then we are not talking about constructivism. Then we are not talking about socialization into the group of making somebody being very similar to you or projecting your own moral compasses, as the EU was doing in the last 30 years as a foreign actor. We are talking about something else, playing the middle field, as you rightfully said that China is playing. So my question to you is, does the EU actually has influence as a moral actor? Because we are talking about being a moral actor in foreign affairs. We are talking about ontological security. Because the EU do not have influence in China like it had in the EU neighborhood or in the EU enlargement process, where at the end of those resolutions can say, oh, we can play carrot and stick with you. You guys do that, and then we do that, and we exchange interests, okay, for the advancement of human rights. So this is the very fast. We can talk later.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you can reflect about the question, and maybe you can answer it in the paper.
Very quickly, first of all, I think there's a matter of equivalence in translating terms between different languages. Probably from the West we are speaking of English as the pivot language for the EU, although you obviously showed the texts in Spanish when referring to the Spanish Parliament, etc. That's a problem, because if you ask, I'm joking with this, but if you ask a Chinese, regular rank and file Chinese in the street, what's your opinion about human rights? The first reply will be, what's opinion? To begin with. But then the other point I want to make excuse me, and it has to do with potential alternative sources. You have mentioned visits of statesmen to China from the EU, and probably other bilateral meetings of Chinese people or authorities coming here. If you checked the speeches, the verbatim speeches, how many times human rights is mentioned by Macron, by whoever who visits China? For instance, I mean, or other terms that you have mentioned there, liberty, freedom, whatever. I think that would be a good measure of how frequently that is really bilaterally exchanged in these meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, Jesús. Sin duda, muchas reflexiones que están poniéndose sobre la...
Thank you very much, Jesus. Many ideas are being laid on the table. It's going to be difficult to answer to all of them, but we will try. Microphone number 2. Is it on? Number 3. Number 3. Thanks, Unai. Thanks for your endeavour and the deep analysis of the European treaties. I have 1 minute and I'll go straight to the point. The question is, do you really believe, after working on this field with treaties and international conventions, do you really believe that the human rights culture, which is one of the cornerstones of the Western world, and not just Europe, but also North America, South America, etc. Do you think that human rights culture can be transferred to the Chinese cultural model? I think that's the background question. What are we talking about? We are trying to create a cultural model that mirrors the Western model, and that might not be possible, especially if we insist on human rights. But so. Camilo. Well, first of all, congratulations. And at the end of the presentation, You mentioned that the European identity I think that your analysis focuses on one single direction, but there's obviously two directions or more. Here we have been speaking about different analysis categories. We heard about the West as a place to produce and reproduce knowledge, which impacts the way we do our research. The international system is based on the liberal peace. And when we speak about justice, we often speak about roles, justice with equity. You do your PhD research in Edinburgh, you live in Belgium, and I come from Latin America, and I have a different background. If you analyze things you're discussing about relations between the North and China, but there is also North-South relations, South-South relations, Southern epistemology, and there are different critical elements to analyze these research. And that's very much related to my own presentation. The way we create knowledge in Europe is great, but some of those categories, like Dr. Moratier just said, need to be nuanced, or we need to go beyond. We need to transcend the traditional way of doing science. Thank you very much, Camilo. Just one more thought from Professor Freixas. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting indeed. I'm just going to say one thing on the European values. Article 2, well, it took over 8 years to come up with Article 2. It was not played by ear. It was not improvised at some point. And it took great consultations, and we had to think through and see how we could do this in an effective way. The goals we had, and I'm saying this because I was a member of the working group drafting Article 2 in the Convention on the Future of Europe. And we thought of federal coercion when values are infringed. That could happen in the US or Germany or federations of the like. That's why we were not satisfied with the final wording, not of Article 2, but rather the protection that we could give to it through the value infraction protection. We saw that that could be insufficient because it could not be applied, and it took unanimity to appreciate that infraction. And a state accused of infraction would never say to or acknowledge to be doing that. This is why other control bodies jumped in and so on. What I mean by this is that values which do have a positive side, they also have natural limits. In the treaty, it is said that, well, especially Articles 2 and 3, they bind internal and international politics, and that means that the EU would have to think it thoroughly in order to include in their political international. Well, the European Union has to think it thoroughly whether they can apply in their international policies the values they are binded by Article 2. There is a complex legal situation here. In the conference on the future of Europe, the topic came up again, and we'll see whether in the EU elections in 2024 the topic comes back up. Thanks, Teresa, for this. And I know that more people want to intervene. You have 30 seconds to reply. I'll try. Of course, when we speak about the European relations in terms of values, the appreciation of those is very complex. And as political scientists, I try to keep them as simple as possible, and I try to put my research into context. And if I did this better, and if I set the limitations first from the point of view of the concepts, and also from the double approach, the positive and the negative approach, maybe that way I could prevent those doubts from arising from when someone reads my paper. It is very difficult to reply to all of you. I'm really grateful for your interest, and I will go over the video when it's uploaded again in case I didn't write everything. And thank you very much. So that's what this seminary is about, and it is food for thought. Maybe we could give more time for discussion, but we have to set ourselves our own limits. But it is also a good idea to have it recorded. It will be very helpful for you to complete your papers, and you can keep on discussing in the bars during dinner. And all this can be very useful when it comes to your contributions. Congratulations also. And now we have a visit to the monastery. See you in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, in case you need to change your shoes or something. But the monastery closes very soon, so I'll see you as soon as possible, as soon as you can make it downstairs to go to the monastery. Thank you very much, and see you tomorrow.